The August morning arrived heavy and slow, the kind of heat that settles into your chest before you've even finished breakfast. In the kitchen of the small rental house on Maple Street, Sarah Bennett stood at the counter, slicing peaches, their golden flesh pooling juice across the cutting board. Her son Michael sat at the table in his favorite striped shirt, the blue one with the frayed collar she kept meaning to replace, drawing astronauts in a composition notebook. He was 8 years old that summer, still young enough to hum while he worked, old enough to ask questions she couldn't always answer. Through the open window came the sound of sprinklers ticking across dry lawns and the distant bark of the neighbor's collie. On the floor by the back door sat Michael's red high-top sneakers, laces knotted together the way he always left them, as if he might need to slip them on and run at any moment. The leather had started to crack along the sides from constant wear, and Sarah had been meaning to buy him new ones, but he loved these specifically for reasons only an 8-year-old could articulate. Sarah called out that she was heading to the store for milk and would be back in 20 minutes. Michael barely looked up, pencil still moving across paper, creating rings around Saturn with careful concentration. He was working on a project for school about the solar system, determined to make his poster the best in class. That was the last ordinary moment. When she returned 33 minutes later, shopping bag handles cutting into her palm, the back door stood open. The notebook lay on the table, pencil rolled to the edge. The red sneakers remained by the door, still knotted together. The house held the particular silence that arrives when someone who should be present isn't, a quality of emptiness that feels different from simple solitude. She called his name once, then louder, her voice climbing toward panic, then began moving through rooms with a mother's rising dread that needs no explanation or justification. Within 2 hours, Maple Street transformed into a staging ground that would become grimly familiar to the neighborhood. Police cruisers parked at angles across driveways, their radios crackling with constant chatter. Officers moved door to door with clipboards and practice questions, trying to establish a timeline, looking for witnesses. Sarah stood on the front lawn, answering the same questions in different formations, trying to remember what Michael had been wearing besides the striped shirt, whether he'd seemed upset about anything, if anyone unfamiliar had been around the neighborhood recently. Her mind kept circling back to those 33 minutes, the extra 13 beyond what she'd promised, wondering if those minutes had made the difference. Her sister arrived and held her while she shook, while the reality settled in with the weight of something irreversible. By evening, search dogs worked outward in widening circles from the backyard, their handlers calling coordinates into headsets as daylight thinned and the golden hour gave way to dusk. Volunteers gathered at the community center with hastily printed flyers showing Michael's school photo, the one where his front tooth was missing and his smile looked lopsided with joy. The image would soon become familiar to everyone in 3 counties, stapled to telephone poles, taped in shop windows, handed out at intersections by people who'd never met the Bennett family, but understood the universal terror of a missing child. If you're watching this story unfold and wondering how a child can vanish in less than half an hour from a quiet street in broad daylight, subscribe to this channel where we examine the fragile moments that change everything. And leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight, because these stories connect us across distances we can't always measure, reminding us that tragedy recognizes no borders. The investigation moved with the urgency that child disappearances demand, that brief window when resources flow freely and interagency cooperation happens without bureaucratic friction. Detective Raymond Marsh, a 22-year veteran with deep-set eyes and a habit of rubbing his thumb across his knuckles when he thought hard about something, coordinated efforts across 3 jurisdictions. He'd handled missing children cases before and knew the statistics, knew that the first 48 hours were critical, that outcomes correlated directly with response time. Traffic cameras were reviewed frame by frame. Sex offender registries cross-referenced with residential addresses. The state police brought in additional personnel. A tip line was established, and within 48 hours had logged over 300 calls, most well-meaning but ultimately unproductive, the kind of vague sightings and half-remembered details that eat up investigative hours while leading nowhere. Someone reported seeing a boy matching Michael's description at a rest stop 60 miles west, purchasing candy from a vending machine while a man waited nearby. The lead sent officers racing down the highway with lights flashing, only to find a family from Ohio whose son wore glasses and was 2 years older, traveling home from visiting relatives. Another caller insisted they'd witnessed a blue sedan circling the block that morning, driving slowly, the driver appearing to watch houses. The vehicle was traced through partial plate numbers to a dental hygienist who'd been lost looking for a patient's house and had an alibi that held under scrutiny. A psychic called offering visions of water and bridges. A conspiracy theorist suggested underground trafficking networks. Detective Marsh listened to everything, followed every lead that held even remote plausibility, and filed the rest. Sarah's life contracted to a single point of waiting, her entire existence compressed into the space between phone calls that might bring news. She couldn't return to her job at the library where she'd worked for 6 years, couldn't focus on anything beyond the absence in her house. Sleep came in 20-minute intervals, if it came at all, and when it did, she dreamed of Michael calling her name from places she couldn't reach. Her sister moved in, handling phone calls and keeping the kitchen stocked with food Sarah didn't eat, with casseroles from neighbors that accumulated in the refrigerator until they spoiled. The calendar on the refrigerator became an artifact of cruelty. Each X threw a date marking another day. Michael wasn't home. Another day further from the morning he'd sat drawing astronauts. His bedroom remained untouched. The astronaut drawings still on the table gathering dust, the red sneakers by the door, like a shrine to interrupted routine. Neighbors organized candlelight vigils on the 1-month anniversary, gathering in the park with flames cupped against the evening breeze, singing songs that felt inadequate against the magnitude of loss. Local news ran features on the anniversary of his disappearance, interviewing Sarah on her front porch while she held a framed photo and spoke words that felt performative, even though her grief was authentic. Then the second anniversary came, then the third, and the media attention began to ebb. Eventually, the coverage slowed to nothing. The tip line went quiet, then was disconnected. Detective Marsh retired after 28 years on the force, though he kept Michael's file on his home desk and reviewed it every few months during sleepless nights, looking for connections he might have missed, patterns that might reveal themselves with distance and time. Years accumulated with the weight of unanswered questions, each one adding to the burden Sarah carried. She learned to function around the absence, to move through daily life while maintaining a space in her mind where Michael remained 8 years old and safe. Her hair went grey early, silver threads appearing rapidly in her 30s like physical manifestations of stress. She became involved with a non-profit supporting families of missing children, finding purpose in the procedural knowledge she'd acquired through necessity. The work gave her days structure and meaning. Something beyond the empty waiting. She learned about NCMEC protocols, about how DNA databases work and why they sometimes fail to match, about the challenges of cross-state information sharing before digital systems improved and standardized. She understood now that most children taken by strangers don't come home, the statistics brutal and unforgiving, but most children who vanish are taken by someone they know, and the statistics offered no comfort either way. She attended conferences where law enforcement officials explained the intricacies of federal jurisdiction and the importance of preserving evidence even decades later, how cold cases could be solved with new technology applied to old materials. She kept Michael's toothbrush in a sealed bag stored in her bedroom closet, just in case DNA comparison became necessary. She maintained his medical records, his school photos, his fingerprints from a child safety event at the mall 2 months before he disappeared. She became an expert in loss by necessity, learning the language of investigations, the bureaucracy of tragedy. Other parents sought her guidance, and she helped them navigate systems she wished she'd never had to understand. She testified at state hearings about missing children protocols. She organized awareness campaigns. She became someone she'd never intended to be, forged by circumstances she'd never invited. 17 years is long enough for technology to evolve dramatically, for databases to merge and improve, for cold cases to be reassigned to younger detectives with fresh eyes and different approaches. It's long enough for a child to become an adult, for parents to age into grandparent years, for hope to calcify into something harder and more enduring than optimism. Hope becomes less about outcome and more about persistence, about refusing to forget. The detective who inherited Michael's case, a woman named Torres with efficient movements and a methodical approach that reminded Sarah of a surgeon, ran routine checks every 6 months. She submitted Michael's information to upgraded facial recognition systems that could process millions of images in seconds. She reviewed old tips that might make new sense with additional context or technological capabilities. She contacted other agencies with similar unsolved cases from that era, looking for patterns that might connect seemingly isolated incidents into something recognizable. The break came not from investigative brilliance or technological breakthrough, but from bureaucratic accident, the kind of random convergence that makes you question whether fate exists or whether probability simply plays out in ways that feel meaningful. A social services worker in a city 400 miles away was processing paperwork for a young man seeking housing assistance after months living on the streets. He'd walked into the office without identification, without a birth certificate, without any of the documentation that greases the wheels of civic existence and allows people to prove they are who they claim to be. He claimed his name was Michael Bennett and that he'd been missing since childhood, taken from his home when he was 8 years old. He said it matter-of-factly, as if announcing he'd lost his wallet rather than 17 years of his life, a flatness that the social worker noted but didn't immediately question. The social worker, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd been trained to notice discrepancies and required by policy to report potential matches to missing persons databases, entered the name and approximate age into the system. The database flagged 17 entries across multiple states, but only one from the right time frame with the right first name and surname. The details aligned too precisely to ignore. She made the call to Detective Torres, following protocol but not quite believing this could be real, that cases this old actually resolved. Torres received the notification on a Tuesday afternoon while reviewing traffic camera footage for an unrelated case involving stolen vehicles. She read the message twice, checked the details against her files meticulously, and felt the particular electricity that comes when a case you've lived with suddenly shifts from theoretical to active. She contacted Sarah within the hour, her voice carefully controlled, professional but not cold. The conversation was careful, measured, each word chosen to manage expectations that had been devastated before. There had been false matches over the years, other children named Michael Bennett who'd turned up safe, wrong ages or wrong locations, hope inflated and then punctured. Families shouldn't hope prematurely, shouldn't allow themselves to believe before confirmation exists. But the details aligned. The age was right. The name was right. The young man had walked in voluntarily, saying words that suggested he knew he'd been found, rather than that he'd sought help, phrasing that indicated some awareness of being searched for. Torres arranged travel immediately, booking flights and coordinating with local authorities. Sarah called her sister, who drove over immediately and sat with her while they waited for more information, both afraid to speak the possibility aloud. The meeting was arranged at a facility designed for exactly these situations, a place with neutral walls and comfortable furniture that specialized in reunifications and custody transfers, and all the administrative machinery around fractured families. Counselors stood by with training in trauma and dissociation. Protocols existed for managing reunifications that might be complicated by years of separation, by abuse, by psychological damage that might make recognition impossible. Sarah sat in a room with pale green walls and generic landscape paintings of mountains she didn't recognize. Torres beside her, reviewing what would happen next, preparing her for possibilities that ranged from joyful to devastating. The door opened after what felt like hours, but was actually 14 minutes. A young man entered, tall and thin with the gaunt quality of someone who hasn't eaten regularly, wearing a grey hoodie despite the warm weather and jeans that hung loose on his frame. He had brown hair that needed cutting and uncertain posture, shoulders curved forward protectively. He looked at Sarah with an expression that held confusion and something else. Something that might have been performance or might have been genuine dissociation, the authentic disconnection that trauma creates. He said the words that would later become the title of news articles and documentary episodes. "You finally found me." His voice was flat, affectless, as if reading from a script someone else had written. Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Every instinct screamed to embrace him, to verify through touch what her eyes couldn't quite confirm. 17 years changes a child into an adult, transforms every physical characteristic. The boy she'd last seen had been small enough to lift, gap-toothed with that crooked smile, always humming unconsciously while he drew or played. This person before her carried none of those markers she'd memorized. His face held only faint suggestions of familiarity, the kind you might see in any stranger who shares your ancestry or ethnic background. She looked at his hands, searching for the birthmark. Michael had a small brown crescent on his left thumb, distinctive and permanent. She'd kissed it countless times, traced it while he fell asleep. This young man's hands were unmarked, the skin pale and unblemished. She felt something crack inside her chest. She asked him to describe his bedroom, her voice barely steady. He said he remembered blue walls, maybe posters of space. Michael's room had been yellow, bright sunny yellow that he'd picked himself, and his posters had featured dinosaurs and race cars. She asked about the sneakers by the door, the red high tops he'd loved. He said he didn't remember sneakers specifically, maybe shoes. Everything was blurry from being so young. The room grew cold with realization, the temperature dropping as hope evaporated and left something harder in its wake. Detective Torres requested fingerprints gently but firmly. "Standard procedure," she explained in her calm, professional voice, "for documentation and confirmation to make the record complete." The young man agreed easily, too easily for someone who'd supposedly been missing for 17 years and had just reunited with his mother, someone who should have been overwhelmed with emotion. He extended his hands without hesitation, let the technician roll each finger across the scanner. The prints were processed immediately through AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system that had become far more sophisticated and accurate since Michael's disappearance, with databases that had expanded exponentially. Results returned within hours rather than days. The prints belonged to a 23-year-old man named Jason Cole, with a record of minor fraud charges in 2 states and 1 charge of identity theft that had been plea bargained down to misdemeanor level. He'd never been reported missing. His actual mother lived in a neighboring state and had last seen him 3 weeks prior when he'd asked to borrow money she didn't have. The confrontation that followed was quiet and devastating, taking place in that same pale green room with Torres present and recording everything. Jason Cole, faced with biometric evidence that couldn't be argued against or explained away, offered a story about mental health struggles and confusion, about reading about Michael's case online and somehow believing he might be that missing child, a delusion rather than deception. His explanation shifted multiple times under gentle questioning, each version contradicting the last. Eventually, a more cynical truth emerged through careful interrogation. He'd been homeless for 8 months, struggling with addiction to opioids after an injury and subsequent prescription, and thought that being identified as a long-lost child might provide resources, attention, perhaps even financial support and housing. He'd researched the case carefully, spent hours reading old news articles and forum discussions, memorized basic details that were publicly available. He'd practiced the story, the flat effect, the confusion. He'd walked into that social services office with a calculated performance. He hadn't anticipated fingerprints. He hadn't considered the cruelty of false hope or the emotional violence of impersonating someone's dead child. Sarah returned home the next day after giving a statement and signing documents, the drive long and silent, her sister at the wheel, while she stared out the window at landscape that looked unfamiliar, despite being the route she'd traveled countless times. The house on Maple Street looked the same as it had that morning when they'd left, thinking they might return with her son, believing for a few hours that impossible things could happen. The red sneakers still sat by the back door, laces knotted exactly as Michael had left them 17 years earlier. She picked them up for the first time in years, held them, felt their lightweight emptiness and the way the leather had dried and cracked with age. That night, she called Detective Torres, who apologized with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many cases go wrong in too many ways, who understood the particular cruelty of this specific failure. Jason Cole was charged with fraud and making false statements to law enforcement. The charges felt insufficient against the weight of reopened wounds, inadequate compensation for emotional devastation. But something shifted in the aftermath of that failed reunion, consequences neither Sarah nor Torres anticipated. The media coverage of Jason Cole's deception sparked renewed interest in Michael's actual case, bringing attention that had long since faded. News outlets ran stories about the impersonation and included details about the original disappearance, reaching audiences who'd been too young to remember the initial coverage or who'd moved to the area after Michael vanished. New tips came in from people who'd been children themselves 17 years ago and now remembered things differently with adult perspective and understanding. A woman called to say she'd been a teenager living 3 houses down and had seen a man she didn't recognize talking to a child in the alley behind Maple Street that August morning around the time Sarah had been at the store. But she'd been too scared to tell anyone at the time because the man had looked at her in a way that made her understand she shouldn't speak, shouldn't acknowledge what she'd witnessed. She described the man in detail after all these years, details that had apparently haunted her. Middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing a white t-shirt with yellow stains under the arms, driving a pickup truck with construction equipment in the bed. The description matched a transient worker who'd been doing roofing repairs in the neighborhood that summer, a man named Donald Pritchett, who'd been hired by a contractor and paid under the table. He'd left town the day after Michael disappeared. According to employment records Torres tracked down through the contracting company that was now defunct, but whose owner still had old invoices in storage. Detective Torres traced Pritchett through employment records, criminal databases, and cross-referenced addresses. She discovered he died 6 years earlier in another state, in a single vehicle accident that might have been suicide given the circumstances, but not before accumulating an arrest record that included charges for child endangerment, unlawful restraint, and possession of child sexual abuse material. His last known address led to a storage unit he'd maintained for years, paying the monthly fee automatically through a bank account that continued withdrawing funds even after his death until the account was finally closed by the state. Inside the storage unit, investigators found personal items that had clearly belonged to children. clothing, toys, school supplies, all carefully organized in labeled boxes. Among them were items belonging to 3 children reported missing across a 15-year span from different states. Cases that had never been connected because they fell under different jurisdictions and predated integrated databases. The discoveries were methodical and horrifying. A striped shirt with a frayed collar, size 8, with a tag that read "Property of M. Bennett" in faded marker. A composition notebook filled with drawings of astronauts, the handwriting clearly that of a child. Inside the front cover, Michael's full name was written in his careful 8-year-old hand, along with his teacher's name and room number. The discoveries brought closure of a kind, the terrible certainty that replaces agonizing possibility but offers no comfort. Sarah attended the evidence viewing with Detective Torres present, identifying items while trying not to imagine the circumstances under which they'd been taken, trying not to construct narratives her mind wanted to build. Michael's case was officially classified as a homicide based on the evidence and the pattern of Pritchett's other crimes. His remains were never recovered, despite searches of properties Pritchett had owned or rented, despite ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, and all the technology law enforcement could deploy. Detective Torres explained to Sarah what she'd learned from her years studying these cases. Sometimes that's how it ends, with answers that confirm loss without providing the body that families need to bury, without the ritual closure that helps grief move forward. Sometimes knowing is as complete as resolution gets. Sarah held a memorial service 17 years and 4 months after that August morning when Michael had sat drawing rings around Saturn. She invited everyone who'd searched, everyone who'd remembered, everyone who'd kept hoping when hope seemed irrational. The service was held in the same community center where volunteers had gathered to make flyers. Full circle in a way that felt both meaningful and cruel. She spoke about the boy who'd loved astronauts and left his sneakers by the door, who'd hummed while he worked, who'd picked yellow paint for his bedroom walls. She thanked the strangers who'd become her community in grief, who'd walked search grids and made phone calls and refused to forget a child they'd never met. She read from the notebook they'd recovered, one of his descriptions of Saturn's rings, his words preserved despite everything. She thanked Detective Torres and the teenager who'd finally found courage to speak about what she'd witnessed. She didn't mention Jason Cole, didn't give him space in Michael's memorial. In the aftermath, Sarah channeled her procedural knowledge into advocacy with renewed purpose, the years of experience now focused by rage at what had happened and determination that it might prevent future losses. She worked with legislators to improve cross-state information sharing for missing children cases, testifying about how Pritchett's crimes across multiple jurisdictions had gone unconnected for years because databases didn't communicate effectively. She trained social workers to verify identities before reunifications, using her own experience as a case study in the importance of biometric confirmation. She spoke at conferences about the long-term impacts of false hope and the importance of managing family expectations during investigations, about the specific trauma of impersonation and the need for protocols that protect vulnerable families from exploitation. She established a foundation in Michael's name that provided resources for families navigating the aftermath of child abduction, offering everything from therapy referrals to help with the financial burdens of prolonged searches that could bankrupt middle-class families. The foundation also funded technological improvements to missing persons databases, ensuring that legitimate matches could happen faster, while fraudulent claims like Jason Cole's could be detected earlier through automated biometric screening. She lobbied for legislation requiring fingerprint verification before family notifications in missing persons cases, a policy that now bears Michael's name in 3 states. The work consumed her in ways that felt healthy, purposeful, rather than obsessive. The red sneakers remained by her door, a private memorial to the morning everything changed. She never moved them, though she dusted them carefully once a week. On difficult days, she would sit beside them, remembering the sound of her son humming while he drew rings around Saturn, remembering the way the August heat had felt heavy and slow, remembering the peaches pooling juice across her cutting board and the sprinklers ticking across lawns, and all the sensory details that had seemed mundane until they became the last ordinary moments. She learned to carry the weight of permanent absence, finding meaning not in resolution, but in the work of preventing other families from experiencing the same void. She testified before Congress about the need for national standards in missing children investigations, about the gaps between state and federal systems that allowed predators like Pritchett to move undetected. She consulted with technology companies developing better facial recognition systems that could age-progress images while filtering out false matches, providing input about what families actually needed versus what engineers assumed they needed. She answered emails from other parents whose children had vanished, offering the hard-won wisdom that hope and acceptance aren't opposites but partners in survival, that you can simultaneously know your child is gone while refusing to stop searching for answers. She helped launch a database specifically for child predators who worked transient jobs, collaborating with construction unions and staffing agencies to create reporting structures that might flag suspicious patterns earlier. The work was incremental, bureaucratic, far less dramatic than the searches and vigils, but it mattered in ways that accumulated over years. Years later, when a journalist asked how she kept going after everything, after the false reunion and the confirmed loss, Sarah looked out the window of her living room, where August light fell across familiar furniture, and said that every unsolved case eventually becomes a choice about what you build in the empty space. She'd chosen to build something that might spare others the particular agony of a reunion that wasn't. The cruelty of a stranger wearing your child's name like a costume, performing grief for personal gain. She'd chosen to transform her procedural knowledge into systemic change, to turn her understanding of investigative failures into improvements that could prevent future failures. She'd chosen to believe that Michael would want his story to mean something beyond its tragedy, that he'd want other children protected, other families spared. The case of Jason Cole became a teaching example in law enforcement training programs across multiple states, included in curricula about identity verification protocols and the psychology of false confessions and claims. New standards were implemented requiring biometric confirmation before family notifications in missing persons cases, a policy shift that seemed obvious in retrospect, but required tragedy to motivate bureaucratic change. Social workers received additional training about the psychology of false claims and the warning signs of deliberate deception, learning to distinguish between genuine confusion and calculated performance. The changes were incremental, bureaucratic, the kind of progress that happens in policy documents and procedural manuals rather than dramatic announcements. But they were real, and they mattered in ways that Sarah could measure. She kept a folder of letters from families whose reunifications had been properly verified because of the protocols she'd helped implement, their joy authentic and documented, their children actually home after shorter disappearances than Michael's. Each letter represented an outcome different from hers, validation that the work created real-world impact. She read them when the weight became too much, when anniversary dates arrived and the absence felt fresh again. She spoke at the weddings of other survivors, children who'd been found and had grown up, who invited her because she'd helped their families navigate investigations or provided financial support through the foundation. She became part of a community she'd never wanted to join, a network of people connected by loss and survival. If you or someone you know has a missing loved one, resources exist that Sarah helped expand and improve. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains active databases and provides family support, their protocols refined over decades. NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, offers free forensic services and case management that didn't exist when Michael disappeared. Local victim advocacy groups can help navigate the investigative process and connect families with counseling specialized for ambiguous loss. The wound of disappearance doesn't heal cleanly, doesn't follow the tidy stages of grief that books describe, but community and purpose can make it bearable. Sarah's foundation continues operating 15 years after its establishment, funded by people who understand that sometimes the best response to irreparable loss is ensuring it teaches us how to do better next time, that it creates knowledge that protects others. On August mornings when the heat settles heavy and slow, Sarah still makes peaches for breakfast, still slices them the same way and watches their juice pool. She still remembers the sound of pencil on paper and a child's unconscious humming, remembers the particular quality of his concentration when he drew. The red sneakers remain by the door, laces knotted together exactly as Michael left them, waiting for no one and everyone simultaneously, a reminder that some absences become permanent but never become meaningless. She's learned to hold both truths simultaneously, that her son is gone in ways that can't be undone, and that his disappearance sparked changes that have helped return other children home, that have caught other predators before they could create other grieving mothers. It's not redemption, because nothing redeems a stolen childhood, or a murdered child, or 17 years of not knowing, but it's purpose, deliberate and earned. And some days, purpose is enough to keep the door open, the light on, the memory sharp and clear as broken glass that's finally been swept into something resembling a pattern you can understand, a shape that makes sense of senselessness. The sneakers wait by the door, and Sarah continues her work, and somewhere other children come home because one didn't, because one mother transformed her loss into a shield for others. That's not justice. But it's something. On the hardest mornings, it has to be enough.